So Nintendo hasn't forgotten about the Zelda timeline. They go from disregarding the timeline for the Wild Tier games to now using it to place the most recent 2D Zelda in a rather interesting place. I'm telling you guys, this type of inconsistency is likely planned to spin our heads and make our passionate hearts burn product awareness. Aside from that cynicism, Echoes of Wisdom and its specific timeline placement has brought one of the most controversial elements in Zelda lore back to light, the downfall timeline. And now we ponder, what the heck is next? Well, one way to understand what's next is to observe history and make an educated guess. So, this is the great potential and controversial history of the downfall timeline. That history being controversial in both our reality and the reality it encompasses. Are these timeline placements or the timeline itself even valid? Do I have a better Echoes of Wisdom placement? Yes, we are going crazy today. So let me give a quick overview of this timeline and some of the actual history and our reality of how it was created. If you want to skip for my better Echoes of Wisdom placement or future thoughts, see the timestamps below. So with all the goodness that the 25th anniversary of The Legend of Zelda brought to us back in 2011, there was one product that erupted across the early Zelda communities. This was the release of Hyrule Historia, a physical book that officially revealed the connected chronology and universe for all the games, even connecting games thought to be in completely separate continuities, like the Four Swords games. This established the downfall timeline, housing the events of much older games with now the newer ones being added. This established the idea of Link dying in Ocarina of Time, or rather failing to stop Ganondorf before he transformed into Ganon with the full Triforce. Some people hated this idea because Link has to canonically fail to successfully explain and connect the original Zelda games many people loved. Anyway, the reason why the release of this timeline was so monumental was because fans' heads have been spinning around for the last 15 to 20 years before 2011 on how the Zelda games were connected, since there were many contradictions and inconsistencies. When The Legend of Zelda first started on the NES, it was simple. Zelda 2 was a sequel to Zelda 1, and that was it. Link to the Past was released on the SNES a few years later, and that served as a contemporary origin story for Ganon, giving him the name Ganondorf Dragmire, as the original evil man who entered the Sacred Realm and later transformed into Ganon. After this, the story goes into the Link to the Past imprisoning war, different from the one in Tears of the Kingdom, of course. This backstory and then the actual game served as a solid prequel to the NES Zelda games. And while that was simple at the time, this is actually the beginning of Zelda lore becoming complicated as heck. See, Link's Awakening released a couple years later as a mini quick sequel or follow-up story to Link to the Past, which no one really had a problem with since that game had no ancient lore revelations and it even took place outside of Hyrule. Then came the release of Ocarina of Time in 1998, and man, excuse me for language, but this is when shit hit the fan. While Ocarina of Time was revered as one of the greatest games ever made and a truly satisfying Nintendo experience, its lore became somewhat inconsistent with how it connected to Link to the Past. And even after Ocarina of Time, future games faded away Link to the Past lore even more. Ocarina of Time lore-wise is meant to be a prequel to Link to the Past, but as of 2006 and still even to now, it just can't be that. Without going deep, Ocarina of Time has the events of Ganondorf as a man entering the Sacred Realm, which is the prologue to Link to the Past. But Ocarina of Time's ending, along with its new sequels, Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and most notably Wind Waker, absolutely destroy the connection to Link to the Past. This is when the timeline officially no longer has any simple continuity. Ocarina of Time's ending, leading into Majora's Mask, has young Link relive his childhood and warn Zelda about Ganondorf, which prevents him from ever entering the Sacred Realm, preventing Link to the Past from taking place after these events. Instead, now, these events are rewritten differently in 2006's Twilight Princess, in which Ganondorf was banished to the Twilight Realm, and it leads into a completely different story that includes dark interlopers from Hyrule's ancient past, as there are no connections to the Dark World or imprisoning war. This is the Child Timeline, a split-off from Ocarina of Time's ending. While this might have seemed like the nail in the coffin for Link to the Past canonicity, it actually isn't. The nail in the coffin came from 2003's Wind Waker. See, Wind Waker takes place in the adult timeline, the timeline after Link was sent away back to the past in Ocarina of Time, but still when Ganon was successfully defeated by him and successfully sealed by the Seven Sages, which is also after Ganondorf entered the Sacred Realm 7 years earlier. Theoretically, Link to the Past being in the adult timeline after all of this in Ocarina of Time actually makes sense and could lead into Ganon slowly breaking his seal, jump-starting the Link to the Past imprisoning war. But instead, Nintendo preferred to replace it with a different story on the repercussions of Link and his bloodline not being present for a long time in this timeline. This would turn into the story of how Ganon returned and no hero appeared, causing the gods to flood Hyrule to temporarily hold off Ganon a bit longer until another hero would be born. So now, once again, Link to the Past canonicity cannot exist. It has to be a part of an unnatural continuity scenario, hence the downfall timeline of Ocarina of Time Link failing. The nail in the coffin. See, I made a whole video on why I have a problem with this story choice of the Flood and how it connects to all Zelda lore, and how I thought previously Echoes of Wisdom could fix this. That video still has some solid ideas, even though Echoes of Wisdom is officially placed somewhere else in the timeline, and the links to that video will be all around and in the description. Anyway, speaking of Echoes of Wisdom, let's get into the mess of that official timeline placement, and then we'll get into future ideas on more games for the Downfall timeline, as well as the benefit of reorganizing it. Stay tuned in, guys, there's a lot more to cover. As I said in the beginning of the video, Nintendo is officially inconsistent with being inconsistent, as in we actually believed them to start straying away from the timeline with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, maybe even Age of Calamity, but now they officially added a brand new game to it after not updating it since 2015. Not only did I expect Echoes of Wisdom to be in this new realm of non-established Zelda continuity, but I also didn't expect Echoes of Wisdom to have an official timeline placement in the official timeline so quickly. I actually believed that the timeline wouldn't be updated for several years until we saw a lot more mainline games like prequels and sequels to Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and even Echoes of Wisdom. And while I was writing videos late last year for reorganizing and getting rid of the Downfall timeline, the most controversial timeline, that's the timeline that Nintendo officially updates with Echoes of Wisdom. What an insane conundrum. I'm very grateful some of the Zelda YouTubers addressed the overall Zelda timeline to their audiences after this, because this situation is very crazy, enticing Zelda fans to go back to the timeline after many gave up on it. But of course now it's my turn, and I'm going to address something that I haven't seen other Zelda content creators address, and that is arguing with Nintendo and the Zelda fanbase that agrees with them on Echoes of Wisdom's official timeline placement. In addition to all this controversy on the Downfall timeline and the Zelda timeline in general, I think there is some continuity error with Echoes of Wisdom being before Zelda 1 and after Link Between Worlds Triforce Heroes. This is what I thought before the official timeline placement and remains my current thoughts after the official placement of The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, and that it goes either before the official Golden Era or after it, being at the end of the Era of Decline, which would be after Zelda 2. I'll explain these eras really quick. The Golden Era is the era after Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes, where the Downfall timeline becomes less of a downfall and Hyrule flourishes for a long period of time, so long that it's written and made clear in Hyrule Historia. A good king utilizes all of the Triforce to establish peace and prosperity for a long period of time, but his son, the prince and heir to the throne, was not to be trusted. This leads into the Era of Decline. The good king became old and split the Triforce in 3 pieces himself, trusting Zelda of that time only, and told her this. The prince then became king, and then was lustful for the Triforce, and then ended up working with an evil sorcerer to find the Triforce, likely an agent of Ganon. The sorcerer put Zelda into an unbreakable sleep, and Hyrule fell apart indefinitely. These events of course precede Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 on the NES, the oldest Zelda games. This history is also mentioned in the Zelda 2 manual, and then reinforced in Hyrule Historia. So now, does Echoes of Wisdom go after A Link Between Worlds since the geography is similar to that game, which is before the Golden Era, or does Echoes of Wisdom go far after Zelda 2, once Hyrule picks itself up again after the Era of Decline? Why do I think it's after Zelda 2? One reason: the Prime Energy. Clearly the events leading up to Link Between Worlds and after Link Between Worlds, as well as the Golden Era, the Triforce is written down and documented and known to the people as, well, the Triforce. In Echoes of Wisdom, the Triforce is known as the Prime Energy, so I believe after the catastrophes set by the Era of Decline in Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, the Hylians reconnect with the gods. Since after Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 there was so much rebuilding required, Hyrule pretty much grew into a new kingdom with new people and new allies. They eventually forgot the name of the Triforce. Noel must have utilized the destruction from the Era of Decline to start the rifts into the Still World. The Hylians prayed for restoration of the land, and with Ganon constantly defeated multiple times, his soul could easily be copied by Noel within the earth. The goddesses picked up on this and communicated with the royal family through the Triforce that Noel would need to be defeated not only with the Hero of Courage, but also with the Priestess of Wisdom. Noel is just that powerful, and the goddesses knew he's not some Ganon ripoff pushover. The goddesses must have referred to the Triforce as the Prime Energy, and that's why the people recorded it as that for the time to come. I would also like to add that so much time has passed that Ganon has been forgotten, as unlike Breath of the Wild, Ganon was not recorded in Hyrule's history at that time. I know that a lot of people are agreeing with Nintendo on Echoes of Wisdom being before Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, but I actually disagree with this because for Ganon and the Triforce to be gone this long, to the point where they're forgotten, it's almost similar to the Breath of the Wild futuristic time jump. In the manual and lore for Zelda 2, and the backstory for Zelda 1, and even alternate media to Zelda 1, the Triforce is called the Triforce. So you're telling me, if Echoes of Wisdom is before Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, then the name of the Triforce was forgotten and then became known as the Prime Energy, and then back to being called the Triforce again, like how we see in the Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 manuals? What the heck? It makes more sense that similar to how Breath of the Wild didn't call the Triforce by name, but was instead known as the sealing power within Zelda of that time, we would now be in an era so far from any of the previous games for the Triforce to be known as the Prime Energy. Let's look at the Gerudo. They're absent from the entire Downfall timeline, even absent from Link Between Worlds, a game released in 2013 after the Gerudo were established in previous games, and then they come back in Echoes of Wisdom, and then are extinct again in Zelda 1 and Zelda 2. There's just a lot of continuity flaws. One more thing about A Link Between Worlds, the link to the past history is illustrated as murals in the Link Between Worlds Hyrule Castle, as well as it's available to the people thanks to Sarashala. Again, why would they forget about the Triforce? Now here's a crazy mind-blowing thought. What if the three goddesses always called the Triforce the Prime Energy as its true name, but Hylia and Fi in Skyward Sword were the ones to start calling it the Triforce, which would then carry over into all the eras following until far after the Era of Decline, which is many, many centuries to millennia after Zelda 2. This would make sense leading into the events of Echoes of Wisdom. And there it is, a solid placement for Echoes of Wisdom after Zelda 2. Oh, and even for you timeline convergence believers, it would also make sense for the Triforce to be forgotten after the adult timeline, since we are in new Hyrule with new life forces and such, and the supposed end of the Master Sword, which would give credence to the Might Sword taking its place. This also makes sense after Four Swords Adventures, as I kind of mentioned earlier, since the child timeline ends with taking focus away from the Master Sword and typical Zelda lore as well, with also Ganon's power coming from the Trident. Which, by the way, the Trident is the only thing that remains consistent among the Ganon battles in Echoes of Wisdom. Could it be the same Trident used in Four Swords Adventures? Either way, this can make Echoes of Wisdom the game or near the era of another future game that converges the timeline. It must at least be after Zelda 2. Alas, I doubt I'll change Nintendo's minds to move Echoes of Wisdom's timeline placement to a place that I prefer. But must I, those who agree with me, and those who don't like the downfall timeline have to accept this? Well, for the future, there is so much potential for this timeline, I can propose some new ideas to help fix it, or at least enhance it. Despite all that I've said in this video, the downfall timeline can still address its issues through the addition of more games and more lore, and really stand as a solid part of Zelda's entire continuity. So, idea number 1. Nintendo gives us a new version of Ocarina of Time, and I'm talking about a full remake like how many Nintendo content creators have speculated and wished throughout 2023 and 2024. But of course, this remake is enhanced with a lot of new content not seen in any prior version of Ocarina of Time. This version would include a dark path, or dark outcome, that actually has Link fail to Ganon and we see it. We actually play through it. Now this opens the door for a lot of creativity. Link could die, or he could be severely defeated like how he was in Breath of the Wild. One creative idea is that we see and play Link failing to Ganondorf, and he actually takes the full Triforce and unleashes hell on Hyrule, but then someone rescues Link and takes his body somewhere. Link wakes up and the game has a whole new path. Seal Ganon despite him having the full Triforce. We've seen Ganon take multiple Triforce pieces before, specifically in Link Between Worlds taking Power and Wisdom, as well as Wind Waker, recombining all 3 pieces together, snatching it from Link and Zelda by force. Anyway, this new dark outcome of Ocarina of Time has Link at a loss for the Master Sword, and strong injuries so much that he's gonna need help, like an Echoes of Wisdom type of situation. Perhaps we get 1 or 2 new dungeons and a different final boss, with the addition of Zelda or maybe even Sheik as a playable character. This would honor and use ideas from the cancelled Sheik game by Retro Studios. Hyrule would be even darker than before. Now all of Hyrule could look like Dark Castle Town. Many allies would be gone. The new extra dungeons would serve as secret gateways to the Sacred Realm, or places of worship to enhance the power of the sages, similar to Wind Waker. This enhancement would give sages enough power to seal Ganon even though he has the full Triforce. Link, Zelda, and the sages would seal Ganon in a different way. Maybe the Ocarina of Time gets destroyed and Link's injuries force him to stay in the present, leading into the events of the imprisoning war. This could also work as a Hyrule Warriors game, especially with the notion of multiple playable characters and possibly including the Link to the Past imprisoning war. Speaking of the imprisoning war in Hyrule Warriors, I did make a video on multiple ideas for a Hyrule Warriors game that takes place within the Tears of the Kingdom imprisoning war. Be sure to check that video out, I'll link to it all around and in the description. Anyway, let's carry on with a couple more game ideas. If you made it this far without attacking my opinions on Echoes of Wisdom's downfall timeline placement, thank you and I shall reward your patience. Let my creative juices support Echoes of Wisdom's placement now. Haha. So here we are now at idea 2A, and it's that we get a game before Echoes of Wisdom and after Link Between Worlds Triforce Heroes. Perhaps the Majora's Mask in this timeline that Link had in his room is taken by a secret Lorulian, who might have been some sort of thief. I mean, the Lorule version of Kakariko had some pretty sketchy people, so we could definitely see something along the lines of that. Perhaps this mask unleashes some sort of hell, which paves the way for Noel to start opening the first rifts, many years before Echoes of Wisdom. A game foreshadowing Noel and utilizing the Majora's Mask that forces history to be destroyed or hidden would be an insanely great game. A super dark and battle against the apocalypse type of story, wrapping up the story of Link from A Link Between Worlds or one of his descendants. I mean, we have to remember that foes like Malladus, the evil Twilight, and moreover Vaati exist in other timelines, so Nintendo could get really creative here. Speaking of creative, here's idea 2B, in which maybe instead we get a game perhaps after the events of Echoes of Wisdom. The Triforce gets its name back by some sort of discovery, and the royal family starts having princes as well as princesses, leading into the tragedy of Princess Zelda I, which is before Zelda 1. Speaking of that, by the way, the tragedy of Princess Zelda I is the story of how Zelda was trapped into a deep sleep by her corrupt brother, the jealous prince. If you've been skipping around in this video, I mentioned that story earlier when I explained the Era of Decline. Anyway, we haven't seen a Hyrule Prince in the Zelda series since, well, Zelda 2's backstory. It's time to bring one of those guys into a fully fledged game. We really need to go from Echoes of Wisdom to the prosperous Golden Era and then the Era of Decline, which is the greatest depression and destruction in Hyrule's history. The game I have in mind as an Echoes of Wisdom follow-up would be a game that has remnants of Hyrule's history connected to Holodrum or Labrynna, since the Triforce sent Link to those places earlier in the timeline after A Link to the Past. Perhaps Conde's brother is in one of those lands, or at least traveled there at some point. Now that would be an interesting story, and something all Zelda fans would want. I mean, Conde is literally a new beloved character among the Zelda community. Surely another game that includes him would be a lot of fun. Anyway, a return to Holodrum and Labrynna would also be a wise idea for new audiences if the Oracle games were to be remade before or after this hypothetical game. As for more story details, I would just imagine a story in which these lands outside Hyrule have ancient archaeological sites containing history of Hyrule, maybe even connecting to the dark outcome of Ocarina of Time, or throwing some Zonai lore in there to spin the heads of Zelda theorists even more. I mean, they could really do a lot, but that's the thing. Nintendo's gotta at least do something. Idea 3. The final idea has another notion yet not discussed on this channel. The official reorganization of the timeline. There is a quote from Hyrule Historia that also serves as support to everything I have discussed in this video thus far. Going all the way back to page 68 in 2011's Hyrule Historia, there's an interesting small paragraph on the page before the official timeline. I'll show a quick picture and read what this paragraph says. Weaving history. This chronicle merely collects information that is believed to be true at this time, and there are many obscured and unanswered secrets that still lie within the tale. As the stories and storytellers of Hyrule change, so too does its history. Hyrule's history is a continuously woven tapestry of events. Changes that seem inconsequential, disregarded without even a shrug, could evolve at some point to hatch new legends, and perhaps change the tapestry of history itself. Alright, so based on what new games have shown to us, it's possible for the Zelda timeline to literally change. While Nintendo isn't likely to adjust the canon based on what majority of the fanbase prefers, instead, they are likely to adjust it based on the new lore they themselves have established. And the crazy fun part is that we can attempt to predict possibilities of this from the lore the new games have been establishing. So how and when would this be done? Well, there's definitely many ways the timeline can be reorganized, and I'm assuming this won't officially happen until we have future games that create new timelines and fill in the gaps of connecting the games, or creating new gaps that still make room for theorizing. To really give an example of how thinking outside the box this could be, imagine Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom as a whole new saga of games, soon to have prequels, sequels, alternate outcomes, and more. Like, start from Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 and work your way through the official timeline. Prequel to a quick sequel, to that prequel to a greater prequel, to another prequel that splits the timeline. Imagine something like that for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. But still, Nintendo can add these games to an adjusted form of the original chronology, starting with Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time being at the heart of the splits. Perhaps Skyward Sword time travel might prove something interesting. Another split. I also mentioned how Echoes of Wisdom can point to a new downfall timeline in a previous video. The gist of that comes from an idea I heard among Zelda YouTubers debate, in which Four Swords Adventures can be before Link to the Past, due to the sages sealing Ganon, who was once Ganondorf, in that type of 2D Zelda world that is akin to A Link to the Past. Of course, the Zelda timeline being officially reorganized and ideas on how that could work is a branch that could go into multiple videos of its own. But I will say this, the Zelda timeline tends to have parallels within its splits, and despite how history might change, certain events are bound to happen. Maybe not at the exact same time or in the same setting, but in the same rhythm or era. We now have two imprisoning wars, both connected to similar Ocarina of Time events, with Ganondorf pledging false fealty to Hyrule. I also mentioned this in my new Downfall Timeline prologue video. I would say something like this opens the door for legitimate Zelda Timeline reorganization, which I am development of a video that fully goes into this. A new timeline split that includes Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom among the original games. If that video is done, I'll link to it here, but if you're watching this before that, which most likely you are, remember, Skyward Sword time travel and the beings from the sky are connected. Anyway, that completes a full dissection, retrospective, and future speculation of the Downfall Timeline. Despite all the controversy, the Downfall Timeline still stands as one of the most unique outcomes I've ever seen in fiction. And believe me, I've always speculated on how stuff like Marvel or Star Wars would work with separate timelines, though with Zelda, the lore's interpretation and presentation stands out as something truly unique. Agree or disagree with any of my ideas or interpretations, or rather, what are yours? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this crazy retrospective analysis and future speculation of a lot of Zelda lore and history, please consider subscribing, share, and leave a like. Be sure to check out my other videos as well. I just made a huge deep video on Tears of the Kingdom Zelda's character development and why the literal Tears of the Kingdom are what they are. While my pre-Echoes of Wisdom theories are mostly proven wrong and outdated, there's still some good info in them that points to other future game possibilities, like how I mentioned a minute or two ago. So take care, peace out, God bless, this was Skylink Theory, and I'll see you guys later.